There has been more reaction from Moscow over U.S. President Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to hit targets deep inside Russia. The foreign ministry in Moscow says Ukraine using long-range missiles would mark a radical escalation of the conflict, a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. The Biden White House has maintained a strict policy of limiting the strike distance of missiles it supplies to Kyiv. That policy has now changed.
Sumy in Ukraine and the aftermath of a Russian aerial attack late on Sunday. Several people were killed and dozens of others injured after a missile strike on a residential building. Piling further misery on Ukrainians after almost 3 years of war. But amidst another night of fear and destruction, a glimmer of hope for Ukraine from the US president. Joe Biden says Kyiv can now start using these US-supplied longer-range missiles to strike targets further in Russia. Seen here being used in South Korea, ATACMS have a range of around 300 kilometers. The Ukrainian president sees them as key to Ukraine's fight back against Russia and has for months been urging Joe Biden to lift a ban on using the weapons to help end the conflict.
The plan to strengthen Ukraine is a victory plan. I presented it to our partners. One of its main points is to equip our army with long-range capabilities. Today, there is a great deal of discussion in the media about us receiving permission for these actions. But strikes are not made with words. These matters are not announced. The missiles will speak for themselves.
While the White House is also yet to officially confirm the details, the weapons may be used quickly and in response to the deployment of thousands of North Korean troops to Russia's Kursk region, an area where Ukraine's military continues to launch aerial drone attacks as Moscow tries to retake territory it lost following Ukraine's summer incursion. Reports of the US decision are making headlines in Russia, with the Kremlin warning that allowing Ukraine to use US-made weapons to strike far into Russian territory would lead to a rise in tensions, while some Russian lawmakers have gone even further, with one of them, Maria Butina, telling the Reuters news agency Biden's administration is trying to escalate the situation to the maximum. They are seriously risking the start of World War III, which is not in anybody's interest. But in Ukraine, as the country prepares to mark 1,000 days of war, this latest show of US military support will be welcomed, providing a timely boost ahead of another bleak winter as Russia ramps up its assaults.
Well, the weapon system in question here is the Army Tactical Missile System, also known as ATACMS. Here's more now on what it's capable of and what Ukraine might use it for.
These are ATACMS, U.S.-supplied missile systems fired from mobile launchers. The high-tech ATACMS use precise guidance components to hit targets artillery can't reach. The Biden administration decision opens up a range of targets that Ukraine has long been asking permission to hit. ATACMS can strike as far as 300 kilometers into Russia. That puts important targets into range, including the annexed peninsula of Crimea, which Ukraine considers its own territory, and the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. The U.S. has reportedly told Ukraine to limit its attacks for now only to the Kursk region, where Russia, with the help of North Korean soldiers, is preparing a counteroffensive to take back territory Ukraine took in August. ATACMS would allow Ukraine to strike ammunition depots, supply lines, and military bases concentrated within its range. However, Russia has also moved many of its valuable combat aircraft and bombers out of the 300-kilometer ATACMS range, including the planes that launch glide bomb attacks that have devastated Ukrainian cities this past year. And there are limited supplies of the ATACMS missiles, which are costly and time-consuming to produce. Ukraine may have already used much of its stocks, and it's unclear how many more the U.S. can send.
Well, for more, I want to bring in now Frank Ledwidge. He's a senior lecturer in war studies at Portsmouth University. He joins us tonight from Oxford. Frank, it's good to see you again. What is your opinion here? Why is the U.S. allowing Ukraine to use these missiles this way now?
Good evening, Brent. Well, in your report, the words timely boost were used, and I think we can see that on two levels. First of all, the political strategic, that Biden, of course, has weeks left, and this will, in some ways, I suppose, leave the contribution of Biden to the war on a relative high, but we mustn't get too optimistic about that. There are the operational reasons. So Kursk is the target area, and some would say the pretext for this, or the trigger factor, was the introduction of North Korean troops. But the point is that Russia is very soon to start a counteroffensive to push back Ukraine from Kursk. And this new deployment of missiles will certainly help that and avoid an embarrassing exit from Kursk, I suspect, by Ukrainian troops. Certainly it will go a long way towards damaging Russian ambitions in that area.
Do you think, Frank, that this change in U.S. policy will make a noticeable change on the battlefield?
Perhaps for the first couple of weeks, depending, of course, on the stocks that have been transferred. The US is short of these missiles. The UK, of course, equally or more short, as is France, of the Storm Shadow and Scalps, which explains their lack on the battlefield right now. So we must moderate expectations. This isn't a game changer. There won't be enough to target every major target, but yes, it will have an effect, particularly, as the report said there, on ammunition supplies and so forth. And of course, it'll cause Russian planning assumptions to change. They'll have to move anti-aircraft and anti-missile assets, I should say, into the area, which will mean they'll be removed from elsewhere. But eventually they'll get the measure of them, as they have all these other weapon systems that Ukraine has been given.
And if I understand you right, this decision will do two things. Really, it's going to secure Joe Biden's legacy as a supporter of Ukraine, but it could also be ensuring that North Korea gets hit where it hurts and that it knows that the United States is behind the power of those missiles. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I think so. And also it does give that message again back to China, and even more distant strategic rival. By the way, there's no evidence that North Korean troops have been deployed yet, and certainly no evidence that they've been involved in combat. I suspect what they will do is backfill Russian troops to just slightly reduce the pressure on the Russians there. But of course, it's the political impact, as you hint, that's most important there. But I have to stress here, this is not a game changer. It's simply another weapon system delivering half a ton or so of explosives to specific targets. And it's not going to change the course of the war.
And what about Russia's response? We heard today from Moscow, warning the U.S. that you're moving us closer and closer to a third world war with this.
Yes, well, that's Maria Butina for you. We can put her where she belongs, which is out of our earshot, I suspect, or rather, I would suggest. Now, look, this won't have any significant effect. There will be no significant retaliation that we'll be aware of. It may be hybrid things going on under the surface we'll never be aware of until the history books are written, but we won't know about those. This isn't sufficiently escalatory and certainly not sufficient to justify any form of any march up that ladder of severe escalation. No way. I'm firm on that.
Before we let you go, Frank, there are 2 months left in the Biden administration, the Biden presidency. Could this be a final chapter in this war, do you think?
No, the final chapters are being written and will be written in the south and east, where the Russians continue to make incremental gains. The centre of gravity is down there, as it always has been. And within that, the most important factors are manpower and of course, to a lesser extent, weapons and ammunition supplies. And in both those levels, I'm afraid the Ukrainians are in some difficulties.
Frank Ledwidge, as always, Frank, good talking with you. We appreciate your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent.
And we're joined now by retired US Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commander of the US Army in Europe. General Hodges, it's a pleasure to have you with us, as always. Can I start by asking you, what battlefield difference will the ATACMS, the tactical ballistic missiles, make?
One, this will enable Ukraine to strike Russian and North Korean headquarters, logistics, and artillery that will help disrupt Russian preparations for their attack, their counterattack against the Ukrainian bridgehead in Kursk. That'll be the immediate tactical benefit, which will undermine the Russian advantage in mass. The second difference it'll make, of course, and you've alluded to it in the run-up to this piece, is that it opens the door for UK and France to allow Storm Shadow and Scalp, and increases pressure on Germany to reconsider its very restrictive policy about Taurus. The third impact, of course, strategically, is that this tells the Russians that the United States, we are not turning our back on Ukraine, and that their hope that we would just quit is going to fail.
So you see the ATACMS essentially effectively countering Russia's recent battlefield advances?
Well, long-range precision is a capability that can render or that can degrade the only Russian advantage, which is mass. So when you have large numbers of troops, the way the Russians and the North Koreans do, they have to have headquarters. They have to have artillery and rocket fire to enable their advance. And then obviously you need the logistics, the ammunition. So with long-range precision, you can destroy all three of those, which significantly degrades Russia's ability to continue its meat grinder tactics. So there's no one weapon that changes everything, but this is an important capability that Ukraine has long needed.
And looking at things from the Ukrainian side, how do you think Ukraine will use these missiles specifically? What will Kyiv's strategy be here? Well, of course, even though the Biden administration has finally agreed to allowing Ukraine to use these, they still have restrictions. They have restricted it to the Kursk bridgehead area. I'm sure the Ukrainians would love to be able to go after Russian airfields and other places from which the Russians are launching these endless attacks against innocent Ukrainian civilians and the Ukrainian power grid. But at least if they are restricted to use in the vicinity of the Kursk bridgehead, they can still disrupt Russian and North Korean preparations for their counterattack against the Ukrainians in Kursk. This, by the way, will also send a message to Pyongyang that if you want to send troops over here to help Russia, they're going to start seeing the numbers of casualties amongst North Korean troops that the Russians have been experiencing. You just alluded to the fact that the US has waited a long time until it allowed Ukraine this capability. So let's talk about the timing. Why is this happening now?
Of course, I don't know exactly why now. The administration, which has done so many good things for Ukraine, has failed, unfortunately, in the critical task of clearly identifying that they want Ukraine to actually win. And if you don't have a clearly identified strategic objective, then you end up with a lot of bad policy, which is what has happened in the case of the Biden administration. I think this is a result of a continued excessive fear that Russia might somehow escalate to use a nuclear weapon. And I think there's almost zero chance that Russia uses a nuclear weapon because there's no benefit for Russia to actually use or to follow through on their threats. Now, why did it just happen? I think this has been something under consideration for a long time. Perhaps this was done in response to the recent surge in Russian air attacks against Ukrainian cities. Whatever the reason, this is a gift from President Biden to President Trump because the policy will already be in effect. And then the Trump administration can choose to leave it in place or not, which is much better than hoping that the Trump administration might change the policy.
You just mentioned the issue of nuclear weapons. You're saying that you don't see that as a huge risk, but let's talk about the risks. You know, how risky is it for Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory with these weapons?
Well, again, the administration has continued to put restrictions on Ukraine so Ukraine cannot use them just anywhere. but I mean, the Ukrainians have been hitting Russian oil and gas infrastructure. They've even hit the airport outside of Moscow. So I see these Russian threats as just that, threats. The fact that they would come out and say that this is a step closer to World War III, that's information targeting U.S. administration and also Berlin, trying to scare us from doing what needs to be done to help Ukraine. The Russians know that they get zero benefit, there are zero upsides for them if they use a nuclear weapon. China has said don't use it. India has said don't use it. Germany has said don't use it. The Biden administration has promised that there would be catastrophic consequences if they used a nuclear weapon. So I think there's nothing good for the Russians if they use it, and they see that the constant threats of using it has actually worked for them. So the Ukrainians, whatever weapon systems they have, they've got to be able to defend themselves. And that means going after the places from which air and missile attacks are being launched that kill innocent Ukrainian civilians every day. And also going after the Russian oil and gas infrastructure, which is what pays for Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine.
Ben Hodges, retired US Army Lieutenant General, thank you so much for your time and for your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for the privilege.
Well, I want to turn now to our Russia analyst, Konstantin Eggert. He joins us from Vilnius in Lithuania. Konstantin, it's good to see you. The Kremlin says that Joe Biden is throwing oil on the fire. This is a major step closer to a third world war. How much of this is bluster? How much of this is real?
Nothing of it is real. Everything is bluster. There's not going to be a third world war because of Biden's very, very limited suggestion that Ukrainians can hit at least some targets inside the Russian territory with the American ATACMS missiles. We saw this rhetoric, or heard this rhetoric rather, many, many times before. There were lots of red lines the Kremlin said the West should not cross. It's the supply of Abrams tanks, then it's the supply of Patriot systems, air defense systems to Ukraine. And you know what? Nothing happened. Third World War did not happen.
And no nuclear threat? No nuclear threat either, Konstantin?
No. There's not going to be a nuclear war because of that. I can say that, and I can bet my reputation, whatever remains of it anyway, on this. No, there's not going to be a nuclear war over Ukraine, and Putin knows very well. In a nuclear confrontation with NATO, and that's going to be a nuclear confrontation with NATO, he's going to lose big time.
The change in policy by the White House, it could be seen as an attempt to hit directly where North Korean soldiers are suspected to possibly be. So you've got Russia as the stage for a proxy conflict between Washington and Pyongyang. Now that, if it's true, is anything but flattering for President Vladimir Putin's ego. How do you see that?
Oh, you're quite right. President Biden is very much concerned about North Korean presence and North Korean adventurism, I'm sure, as that's how Washington describes it. Because, as you know, about, I think, 40,000 American troops, if not more, are facing off potentially with North Korean army in Seoul, in South Korea. The border between the North and the South is very close to Seoul. I've been there. So for the Americans, this intervention by Mr. Kim, his idea to help Mr. Putin, of course, for money and a lot of other stuff, is absolutely something that's linked to vital American security interests. And yes, Putin here is just basically a bystander looking at the game between the Pyongyang and Washington. And yes, I think what you mentioned, Brett, is very important. Judging by the reports in the U.S. media, this sort of permission for the Ukrainians to strike Russian targets, first and foremost of all, aimed at the Russian forces and North Korean soldiers that are supposed to try and push the Ukrainians back out of the Kursk Oblast of Russia. It's not about the whole of the conflict. It's more about a very specific theater of this conflict.
And in 2 months' time, Donald Trump will be back in the White House. Are you expecting then a quick end to this war as Donald Trump, the presidential candidate, promised?
No, I do not think so. I think it's going to be even if the Americans try to impose some kind of quick fix on the situation, I don't think it will work. First and foremost of all, President Zelensky said quite rightly, I mean, Ukraine is an independent country. It's fighting it's for its survival. And to end this war because someone in Washington or London or wherever wants it, is just not on the cards for Zelensky. You have to remember his own people that
Konstantin, what happens?
And
what happens, though, if Washington says no more military aid?
I think I can't make predictions. You know, we're not in that business. But still, I think what's going to happen is that the Trump administration will try to impose certain conditions on both sides. And my suspicion is that Putin will feel that anyone trying to impose any conditions on him is basically not giving him the dignity he deserves. I think that these initiatives, if they ever happen, by the way, will be ruined by Moscow, not by Kyiv.
And before we let you go, we're talking about 1,000 days of this war. Do you think we're going to be talking about 2,000 days of this war?
Brent, I hope not, but that's the only thing I can say now.
Yeah. All right. Well, you are the eternal optimist, and that's why we like you. DW Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert joining us from Vilnius tonight. Konstantin, as always, thank you.